Hi, welcome to the channel. My name is Fred Gambino. I've been working as an illustrator and concept designer for over 40 years now. I originally started out as a book cover artist, working traditionally in oils and acrylics until I jumped onto the digital bandwagon in the 90s. And then I worked as a concept artist on various movies and games, movies like Guardians of the Galaxy and Thor Ragnarok. So just lately I've started going back to working in oils. But it seems a shame not to use all the digital tools I've learned how to use over the last 20 years. So these videos are about combining the two disciplines. This is the painting I'm going to take you through today. It's oil on canvas and it's inspired by the second in my Dark Shepherd trilogy of novels. The second book is going to be called Reality Rift and hopefully it'll be published at the end of 2025. I'll add a link below if you're interested. I'm just going to take you through the steps I went through to arrive at this composition. I will work it all out digitally because obviously it's easy to make changes that way. I wanted some kind of dramatic space scene, something like the cover of my first book. This image is one of a number of ideas I had for that first book but didn't get used, but I thought the background nebula would still make a good start. So a few years back we had a massive storm over the house with some very dramatic skies, so I rushed out and took a load of pics with my phone and they became the basis for the background. I switched off all the layers apart from the bits that I needed and then selected the canvas, which would be Command A, and then selected Copy Merge from the Edit menu. Photoshop will now place a combined image of all the visible layers on the clipboard, so when you create a new layer it will be the same pixel size as the copied image, and now all you need to do is paste and the copied image will fit perfectly into the new document. So you can see there's already a bunch of layers here. This is actually the original Photoshop file. I'm just recreating parts of what I did so I can show you the steps I went through. At this point I'm not really sure where this image is going. I'm just trying stuff out, just throwing things at the wall to see what will stick. So I'll just start using the transform tool to stretch and distort the layer. If I switch this layer off, the one underneath is how it ended up. So then I duplicated that layer, moved it sideways, duplicated it again, but this time I added a layer mask so I could paint parts of it out. So that's something of an inspiration. I pasted this image into the document. This is an oil painting I did a few months ago. It depicts a scene from the end of book 2. There's a process video for this one as well, and I'll put a link to it at the bottom if you want to watch it. Again, I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but I begin with the transform tool, just twisting it and distorting it. So if I switch this new pasted layer off, you can see what I did with the original, and I set the blending mode to overlay. So then I duplicated the layer, moved it off to one side, and I set this new one to multiply. The cover to my first book, Dark Shepherd, was very warm, lots of reds and yellows. So to ring the changes a bit with this one, created a colour layer and filled it with blue. That's one of the great things about Photoshop. You can just add a colour layer and you can change the whole mood. Thought it was a bit light on the left hand side, so I added a dark gradient on a new layer and set that layer to multiply. Decided I didn't like the rocks on the left, so I took them out. So I got a bunch of lens flares in my photo library, so I added one of them and I set that to screen. And then I duplicated that so I could add a distant star on the left hand side to balance the composition. I added another gradient to the left hand side to darken it, then I added a star layer at the top of everything. I use this star layer all the time. Years ago I made it by sprinkling white paint onto black paper with a toothbrush. So if I set the layer to normal, then zoom in, you can see it properly. Once I scanned the painting, I took it into Photoshop and I applied a slight glow around each star just to give it a little bit of something extra. And now it's become my go-to star field. I just use it all the time. So I got layer mask on this to hide the stars where I don't want them, and then I set the layer to screen. Screen mode knocks out all the blacks, so you're just left with the white stars. So now I'm looking for a spaceship. I looked through my collection of 3D models and I came across this kit bash ship that I did some time ago. It's been kicking around my hard drive for years and its time has finally come. So if I drag the interactive renderer into view, you can see how I moved it around looking for an angle that I liked or might match the background. And in the process of doing that, I tipped it vertically and thought this looked more interesting and it actually matched the background design. Jumping back into Photoshop, this is how it ended up. I just felt that the vertical angle was just a bit different, a bit more of a unique design. So now I need to turn the image into a line drawing, and I fell back on my favourite Photoshop filter, which you'll all know if you watch some of my other videos. It's under Filter, Stylize and Fine Edges, and you never really know how it's going to end up, but again, it's not a bad result for one click. So I duplicated the layer and made the upper layer multiply to increase the contrast. So this may seem a bit long-winded, but since I'm using existing assets, it didn't actually take me that long. It probably took me about an hour start to finish. And it's quite a serendipitous way of working. You never really know what you're going to end up with. So finally we can start painting. My preferred ground at the moment is a fine grain canvas. I've got a big roll of this stuff and I can just cut whatever size I want and now stretch it onto board so I can prime it, and I like to add a colour that's complementary to the overall colour of the image. So in this case it'll be an orangey colour. I've gone through a certain amount of trial and error to find the best way of stretching these canvases. And it's a journey you can share with me if you like by watching some of my other videos, but this is the way I do it now. So basically I stretch the canvas using masking tape. I put a piece at the top and then pull it tight. You end up with a ridge running down the middle if you're doing this correctly, and then you do the same thing on the other sides, pulling it tight, and if you will lose that ridge, the canvas will go down nice and flat. Since the canvas is fairly big, I'm going to put some more tape in between those, and then finally I'll put some all around the edges. Once it's stretched, I add a couple of coats of gesso primer because I find the canvas is actually a bit dry and the paint tends to be absorbed by it, so it makes it a bit harder to apply. So if you put primer on it, the paint tends to lie on the surface a bit more, which personally I prefer. So as I was saying before, when the primer is dry, I like to paint a complementary colour. So I'm going to use acrylic for this because I don't want to wait days for it to dry. But the trouble with acrylic is that it can dry so quickly, dries on the palette and it becomes unusable. So a little tip for getting around this is to soak some kitchen towel, put it in a baking tray or a shallow tray of some kind, whatever you've got, then put a paper palette on top of that. If you haven't got a paper palette, you can just use greaseproof paper. Yeah, it doesn't really matter. As long as you keep the paper towel moist now, the paint will stay usable. So like I said, since the painting is mainly blue, I'm going to use an orangey colour as an undercoat. This colour will peek through the blue here and there, and it'll add some variety and vibrancy to the finished painting. And for this I'm using cadmium yellow deep, which has become one of my sort of favourite orangey colours. So I've left this for about a day to make sure it's thoroughly dry, and then I strip the canvas off the board so that I can put it on a light box, and this way I can trace the line drawing. And the line drawing I printed out on my inkjet printer. It's bigger than my printer can manage, so I printed it out onto several sheets and put the sheets together. And again, I covered how to do this in one of my earlier videos. Now I've taken it off the light box, put the light box actually has become my light source here, so I can see the drawing to properly finish it off. Just adding some shading to the ship, and we're ready to start painting. So I've had to repeat those earlier steps to stretch the canvas back onto the board and just make it easier to paint. As usual, I'm starting with the darkest tones. The ship is pretty much a silhouette, so I'm going to start there with a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Now move on to the darker parts of the nebula, just using the same colours. At this point I'm adding the first shades of blue, which are a mixture of ultramarine and cerulean blue, ultramarine's quite a warm purpley blue, cerulean is much colder. The bright centre's a representation of some kind of portal or rift in space-time after the reality rift title of the book, and it's mainly cerulean blue and white. I wanted to have a real feeling of light bleeding out from that, so the smaller rocks are just a little bit darker than the blue, and then the big rock in the centre I've painted that streak of almost white with a touch of blue to give a feeling of light pouring over it. So now I'm adding a few highlights to the rocks and some warmer tones using crimson to break up the blue. Most of it's roughed in at this point. I'm just adding a few final highlights. So this is it at the end of the first day. Took about 2.5 days to paint all told. And here's the final thing. I made the left hand side darker to keep the viewer's eye in the frame, and I added some stars, flicking them on with a toothbrush. You'll also notice I added some streaks to add some motion and to give a sense of falling into the rift. I thought the ship was looking a bit like a dead hulk, so I added some lights to the nose, giving an impression that there might be somebody on board. So I hope you found the video useful, that it might spark some ideas of your own. If you've got any questions, add them to the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. And if you did enjoy it, of course, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.